Folks, welcome to Thru Port Collective, and we've got a very fun show tonight. Something that I've been looking forward to doing for a while now, and we're talking about all things bass and bass of all sorts. So bass guitar, synth bass, 808, whatever you guys want to talk about. And of course, we have Shawn Saul joining us tonight. And hey, how's everybody doing?
I'm doing great, Cryss. Thanks for having me on. Welcome. Thank you so much, Tim and Marshall and everyone for having me on. I'm really excited to be a part of the Thru Port Collective tonight.
Yeah, man. Glad to have you. Yeah, no, doing good here.
Yeah.
Doing good here.
Doing good here also. I have one of these.
Well, tell us a little bit about that.
Dude, we're going to have a discussion because I just got an Iridium module and I was thinking about either getting an MP controller or selling it for a keyboard. So let's throw that shit in there.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely.
So just before we get started, of course, the show is about musicians getting together and talking and just sharing our experiences and our tips and techniques and all that kind of stuff so that we can, grow and learn from one another. And we truly try to make it something that's positive and, hopefully we'll all grow and leave from the episode having, gained something and learned something. That happens every week for me talking to these guys and everybody in the chat. So glad to see everybody, see all our friends hanging out in the chat and talking. And also, if you'd like to talk more during the week, we have a Facebook group. It's called Thru Port Collective, and you're welcome to join. And we have discussions during the week about different topics or things that pop up that are of interest. So find us there. And we're also on Instagram. I just post show announcements there. So if you want to kind of keep up on what's happening for the next week, please join us there. And of course, give us a thumbs up if you think about it. So, well, we want to jump in here, but we want to talk a little to Shawn and kind of let everybody know who you are and tell us a little bit about you, about your background as a musician. What do you do?
Okay, well, hey, everybody. My name's Shawn Saul. I'm a professional bass player, a professional educator, and originally from Miami, Florida, currently based out of Jacksonville, Florida. And I have, been from the age of 14 to the age of 22, was in some sort of bass training and was very fortunate and got to, when I was in high school, study at the University of Michigan in Berkeley for bass, taking private lessons, and eventually, went to the University of Miami for jazz bass performance as an electric bass player. And, from 18 till now, I'm almost 34, I've been professionally playing with different artists and genres and recording and, with the jazz background and being from Miami, anything from funk and Latin and reggae and Caribbean and trip hop, and I've played in live hip hop bands and R&B, neo soul, and alternative rock. And so, I would say, nowadays, I'm getting hired. Last week, I did a jazz gig, and then I did a funk jam band gig, and then did a rock gig, and then did a church gig. So, the knowledge of learning music, being a musician, life experience growing up in a place where there's a lot of mixed culture, different backgrounds, it's been able to allow me to adapt as a musician and just play with different artists, different styles. And, I teach music, I do private bass lessons and, guitar and piano too. And, but I'm really into producing and writing and arranging, and I really enjoy, synthesizers and electronic synthesis. And I would say that for everybody out there, used to be a guest on a synthesizer podcast, you know, and I met these guys through that. And it's just been a pleasure to see the Thru Port Collective develop and have an opportunity to talk about what it's like being a bass player and everything about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So where are you at right now?
Okay, guys. So I was hired to be, I often am a sub, you know, and I call myself a 911 bass player. And, you know, people who bail on gigs last minute often call me. And so there's a jam session in downtown Jacksonville. And here, I'll roll down the window so everybody can hear. And I was in the house band, and I played from 6:30 to close to 8. And now I took half of my gig money that I'm getting paid, and then I asked somebody to finish it. And, you know, this is what it's like being in the real world and having to deal with being double booked and, you know, make smart decisions. And so I don't know if you can hear, there's some pretty badass guitar solo. And, you know, Jacksonville is a pretty cool place. A lot of people don't know that bands like famous punk bands like Red Jumpsuit Apparatus, Yellow Card. You know, I'm working with the Yellow Card guys. You know, people from the Leonard Skinner, Allman Brothers, Southern Rock. I get to work with people like that, and get to work with people in the R&B and jazz community. And you know, there was just Jazz Fest up here. Marcus Miller was up here, a bunch of badasses. So it's been cool, you know.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a pretty interesting music scene there, and we talked a little bit yesterday about that too. That it seems pretty lively in Jacksonville for music, which is great.
Surprisingly, you wouldn't think so. You'd think it's just like another whatever little southern town in Florida, but you got to consider that only an hour away is Orlando. You know, a little more is like Daytona. You go more south, you go more north, and you get like Georgia, and you know, so there's a lot of bands and people that come in and out, and it's just a decent place to be because, you know, I would say it's like if you're an outsider and you have experience and you hear, you can be like a bigger fish in a smaller pond. And from what I've heard, you know, New York, LA, a lot of the big places nowadays, post-COVID, it can be very difficult to thrive in what people used to think are, you know, not to say, you know, the major scenes, right, aren't still there and thriving, but, you know, there's other little places, and, you know, people should support their little, you know, the community, local community music scenes. They can grow.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's great, you know, and it's it'll be interesting to get your take on all these things, and it's been really great talking with you over Facebook and everything. We've been chatting for a while and talking gear and music and bass and all this, so it's great to finally have you on the show, because definitely the person we had in mind back when we started bringing this topic up. So, well, let's jump into it, and this is just like a beginning of the topic, really. I mean, we like to do these episodes and kind of explore around and kind of get people's perspective on it, but we want to talk about bass in general, why it's important, how we're doing it, and see if we can you know, kind of explore that topic. And so, guys, I wanted to maybe start really broadly, I guess, in a very big picture. Like, for each of you guys, what was like your first kind of introduction to bass of any sort, any musical genre, where it really stood out to you? And then also, as far as people that do bass well, and again, for any bass instruments, who are some of the standouts for you? I know who'd like to jump in first and get us started on that.
guess I could start real quick. I grew up in the '80s, so a lot of the synth-based stuff was pretty cool. I always thought, and then in the '90s, I started listening to like Korn and some of those bands, Tool. They got and Primus, stuff like that. But I've always liked the electronic bass the most that you heard in like the '80s, and then of course when the techno stuff started coming in, more simple kind of bass lines, but really cool bass sounds, like the Lately bass patch from the DX7. That's like the only good patch on there. So that's kind of. I think that some of those rock bands, though, in the mid to late '90s, I think were really when I started noticing, some differences in how bass was being utilized in music.
Yeah. How about you, Tim?
Yeah, bass has always been really important in my world, especially as a drummer. So I mean, I have a special place in my heart for bass players and the nature of what that does and how it matches up with what I do. And my brother is 6 years older than me, and he's a bass player, and so he kind of helped me up into the world of being a musician. And so he and I ended up by the time I got good enough to play on his level, which took a while because he's fantastic. But he was able to pull me up into some gigs, and so we became, the brothers Grogan, and we both can sing a little bit, and I was playing bass or drums rather, and he was playing bass, so we got hired on a lot of gigs as a rhythm section and plus some vocals. So like that's definitely one of my bigger introductions as to bass players and as to how they will glare at a drummer if the time seems to be slipping.
Who are some of your inspirations when it comes to bass and when you go to creating your own music?
Wow. So like in an electronic sense?
Yeah, or
just in general.
Just in general.
Wow, I mean, my bass heroes are, probably Tony Levin and Leland Sklar and Jackson.
Yeah.
Those would be my early heroes. Probably, I mean, Stevie Wonder's bass playing, I think, is crazy cool, and that kind of excited me about using synths as bass instruments too, which kind of made me not afraid to follow that path with my band,
Yeah.
And attempt to play some bass and some chords, and do a little singing. So, man, there's so many great. Anthony Jackson, like I said, I loved him. There's so many great bass players. I mean, and then you have the classics like Ray Brown and dudes that go way back. I mean, it's kind of impossible. There's so many. Where's my T-shirt? That's hilarious. It's true, though. I mean, we had that little buzz. We had that little buzz for a while, but yeah, man. I mean, it's impossible to name them all, and it kind of, obviously, I don't know, like Jaco. I mean, there's so many. It's just impossible, I guess, to really name. But I mean, I love a lot of like no frills bass players too. That just get down in the trenches and just get dirty and groove their asses off. So. It's a big question. I hope I answered with some. I can't. There's no way I can fill in all those blanks.
Well, what do you think, Shawn?
So, I'll tell you like how I got into bass, and then my bass influences are kind of funny because, to be honest, I got, I was like came up in the 90s culture, so I kind of got wrapped into like skate punk, that whole thing, and I really was just like a poser, and there were skateboarders playing punk, and I like wanted to be like that. But then really quickly, as Arnold was saying, as Marshall was saying, 90s bass players for me is where they were at in the beginning, and probably the first was Flea of Red Hot Chili Peppers, and in particular, I was a really big fan of Blood Sugar Sex Magic and his lesson video, which was super psychedelic, super improvised with Rivers Phoenix, God bless them. You know, it really gave me a sense of a philosophy of improvisation, not just about bass, you know, hearing bass or playing bass, but Flea was definitely a big influence. And then, you know, I was also really big and kind of trekking backwards into the influence of your influences and getting into Parliament, Funkadelic, Bootsy, New Orleans stuff like the Meters, George Porter. And so a combination of getting into like the dirty funk, Parliament, Funkadelic, that all those wet, you know, because Bootsy would use a Mootron and stuff. And before I was into synth, I would hear shit like that. So I think subconsciously that's how, you know, I probably got into synth space too. But then, you know, when I heard Jaco Pastorius, you know, that kind of changed things. And, you know, I'm from Fort Lauderdale where he grew up. So there's a lot of big legacy with Jaco and South Florida and jazz fusion. So I would say on a big level, you know, Jaco was, you know, a big influence. And, you know, then people like Victor Wooten and Marcus Miller and Stanley Clark, and but even like Clifford Burton, you know, and I was very inspired by, you know, anything where the bass was the cutting edge in the music, you know, that's the, you know, so I didn't care if it was metal or prog, Geddy Lee, or, you know, jazz fusion or funk. I just, wherever bass was heavy and really groovy or cutting edge, you know, yeah, so, but then, you know, I was really influenced just by, you know, jamming with people, you know, meeting up with people and improvising, you know, not knowing songs, but knowing scales or just, you know, trying to imitate grooving. And so that was a big thing.
Yeah. I think, trying to go back and remember and some of the like earliest examples, like you probably wouldn't have expected this from me, but probably kind of the 808 sounds were the first big impression on me. I just remember like in the late 80s, and especially some of the music that was out at the time, that there was a lot of that stuff going on, and I didn't really like before I started playing guitar, and I didn't really have a conception of what was making that sound, but just, you know, when you had a stereo and it just had that deep throbbing, you know, huge bottoming going in that. And then after I started playing guitar, you know, I started picking up on you know, bass guitarists. And so particularly about a year after I started playing, like I was playing with a band. There was a really fantastic bassist that really, and he was, I mean, he you know, could do a lot of like funk, popping and slapping, and then also like some really cool growly, like Geddy Lee type stuff, and how it was pretty diverse. And so that made an impression for me to like kind of check into bass playing and bass players. So like some of the guys that were mentioned already definitely hit home for me. I mean, Geddy Lee was huge for me, and like you said, Flea, as, you know, in the 90s, like watching those instructional videos and stuff. But same thing, Blood Sugar Sex Magic was a huge big album at the time, and I remember really getting into that, and was the reason that I bought a Stingray, in fact. But some of the classic rock bass, some of the classic rock bass players, you know, like Paul McCartney, early Beatles stuff, I don't really care. You know, like his bass playing isn't anything; it serves the song. But when the psychedelic,
great.
Yeah, I mean, he did a great job of what he did. But like when the psychedelic era hit, like from about, you know, Revolver especially on, it got really serious for me. Like man, this guy's writing some crazy bass lines, and I definitely like tend to go towards the melodic over like just the simple rhythmic. But again, both serve their place, and depending on what you're doing. But yeah, that was kind of my introduction into it.
I will say on the Beatles note that Something is like for anybody out there, an amazing like lead melodic bass line, you know, that's not just a simple rhythm type, you know, Cryss, that'd be a great example of like,
oh yeah,
it doesn't repeat, you know, it carries the song. You could play that on like a synthesizer or something. That'd be badass, you know?
Yeah,
Cool
so
one.
just to make clear, if people aren't familiar with it, the song is called Something, off of Abbey Road. Yeah, I mean, it's a George Harrison song, and he just kills it on there melodically. It's a really beautiful bass line, but yeah, so much of the stuff he played was really trippy, and you know, like the bass line from Hey Bulldog is like just really kind of a weird thing, but it's cool. Well, I don't know how.
I know.
Kind of what direction you guys want to head next. I mean, one of the things, you know, we can kind of go in different directions, but I am at some point, I'd at least like to talk about like how you guys are doing, how you guys are making bass lines, also how we are writing it.
Yeah.
What direction do you guys want to go?
I have questions for Marshall.
Yeah.
What you got?
Just to break open the ice.
Sure.
A little bit, because there's a million questions. Well, no, I'm just curious about what is your usual first move when you're creating a bass line? Like, what do you go to? What instrument do you tend to go to, and how do you approach it?
It just kind of depends, because most of these synths in here will do a pretty good job making bass, right? So it's kind of pick of the litter, just kind of what I feel like using at the time. But because I do mostly, you know, trance and techno, I use a lot of arpeggiated bass lines. So the first thing is I'll dial up a sound, get a basic 4/4 beat going, and I'll start playing with the arpeggiator and just trying to figure out patterns and stuff, and kind of start there.
When you use an arpeggiator for a bass line, see, what I would probably do is go more of a sequencer route. So this is already interesting to me about why you would choose arpeggiation as the means to do a bass line. So yeah, how does that work for you?
Well, because you can actually, with the Blue Art plugin or the hardware that I use, you can make it act like a sequencer as well, even though it's an arpeggiator. So if it is a simple bass line that doesn't need anything crazy going on, I can still do that with that tool, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
just the flexibility there.
Yeah.
Sequencers, I feel like I feel like I'm kind of restricted for whatever reason, and you know, some of them only have a certain number of notes that you can do, and you can't control them in real time necessarily, I guess. Well, maybe some of them you can transpose maybe, but I can do all that with the Blue Arp, so that's what I use.
That makes sense. And so when you, what is your, I mean, I know you have a lot of choices and a big palette there to choose from, but what do you find yourself going to most often instrument-wise?
Like I said, it'll depend. There's not really one thing that I go to.
Not one?
Yeah. I may start out with doing some software just to get things going, and then I may change it up with some hardware later as well. So
what part of the songwriting process do you go to bass? I know when we've done collaborative projects, like bass has been something that's been one of the first things that's been put in there. Would you say that's generally your practice, Marshall?
yeah, I'd say I tend to start with a bass line of some kind. Although for the live stuff I'm working on, I actually have more of the melodic stuff in my head. And I haven't thought about the bass yet, but that's because you can go the other way around, right? You can come up with some melodies and then fill in your bass line to match as well. So if I don't have any ideas and I'm just noodling around, I like to start with drums and bass.
That's cool.
That's cool, yeah.
Yeah, because it just establishes a groove, right? And then from there I can come up with melodies and progressions and things like that to play on top.
Yeah.
Well, maybe let's continue with that. Like for composition and recording, not dealing with live playing yet, but for the music that you write and that you make, like where does the bass come in to that process, and what are you using with it? And whoever wants to jump in.
Well, let's ask Shawn that. Shawn, so field that question, because obviously you are a bass player, so that does not necessarily mean that you start with bass as your writing tool, right? So, like, yeah, expound on that.
Yeah, so you're right. You know, as a bass player, there is a strong tendency to want to start with a bass line, but I don't always. But for me, it's so easy to just hum a bass line, kind of like beatboxing or tap or try to hear something in your head, that I like to kind of go into a daydreamy type of process and just kind of jam in my head until I find a rhythm, you know, and that rhythm probably could be the basis for a drum part and a bass line too, or both, you know, like unison. But I like to, even before instruments or anything, just try to see if there's anything I can bop my body to or clap out, tap out. And, you know, if I was going to record something, you know, like where I'm going to like write and produce something, I do like to put the bass line first in many ways, because it makes it easy to create a structure. You can extract a chord progression from it. But, you know, a cool thing you can do is like write a bass line, just even a simple bass line, as a starting point to then actually, you know, to come up with like a chord progression. And maybe you don't even use that bass line, but it just helps you get started. So the bass, for me, I like doing it to like build a form, because it's just, you know, for me, as an improvising jam band jazz guy, there's so much of what I do is live. So if like when it comes to writing, if it's not a bass line though, I like chord progressions or a riff. So bass line, chord progression, or riff is probably, and when I feel like you get one, you can get the other two.
Mm-hmm.
And if I was more of a drum-oriented guy, maybe I'd start more with trying to build that, you know, from the drums. But I'm more of a reactor, you know. Often I'll put little loops on, you know, and write a bass line to that or something. Yeah. So that's kind of how I start the writing process.
So I guess I'm tend to do it a little bit later in the process, and I don't know if that's maybe has to do with something with my influences and maybe the way they went about it more. But I tend to think like when I'm getting stuff together, it's either a guitar or synth stuff that's starting the song, trying to find some drum stuff and that to get that proper feel and the groove with it. And then when I've got the drums and the rhythm guitar done, is usually the next step in the process for me is to do the bass line. And it's something that I really enjoy, that part of the song is writing the bass line. And most of the time I do it on bass guitar, though I have done some songs with synth bass. But to kind of sit down there and like once I've got like the rhythm stuff, the guitars and drums kind of worked out, I almost like to get that done, because when I sit down with the bass, I want to kind of change my mindset and be a bass player and not just be a guitar player that's playing bass, but to actually sit there and go, okay, what is this going to do, and what's this going to, what part is this going to serve in the song? And sometimes that doesn't mean like even moving it back a little bit further in the process till after vocals are done. And I think that's some of my favorite bassists. I obviously, if you're working in a band and creating music that way, the process is not quite so linear, and you have a lot more back and forth with the other musicians, that you kind of work on parts simultaneously. But when you're doing it by yourself, you know, what sometimes inspires me is the way that a really great bass player will support the lead vocal and do things that are interesting and with the harmonies with the lead vocalist. So sometimes it goes up a little bit further, you know, like about the third thing that I do, and other times I hold back, or I do something that's just real simple to get the song laid down, do the vocals, and then bring the bass into that, where I feel like it will play a supporting role to that lead vocal, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
What about you, Tim?
Yeah, wow. It's just such a fun thing to even discuss, because the nature of when it happens and how is very intriguing. For me, it varies. It really does. It depends on the nature of like how the groove or whatever, how the song. Sorry, I'm picking up.
Yeah, I think we're getting a little bit of noise.
Sorry.
I'm picking up Rangoon, I think. Hold on. Oh. Anyway, yeah, no, I mean, it just kind of I don't necessarily have. I don't think a tendency to do it any one way, because I might hear a chord progression since I play piano or whatever. I mean, I could easily come from that, or as a drummer, I might hear like a tempo and a feel. You know, it might be an eighth note feel, or it might be more of like a 16th note feel, and I've already got sort of a framework in my brain of like kind of how the groove is, and so then I could start kind of wherever in that case. So, but I mean, that would be sort of starting from drums, and then sometimes, you know, yeah, I can just hear a bass line. So like in the Pin Jones Conspiracy, that, you know, I have written a few songs that started with a bass line, and one of them is called Nicotine and Truth, and it's a synth bass line, and it's like, it's strange. It's like E minor for a couple bars, D minor for a couple bars, and then C minor for a couple bars. So it's not like consonant. It's kind of just playing minors no matter what. But it's all around this bass line that I wrote. So it kind of depends for me. You know, it's fun to let it be a guide, like what Shawn is saying, where you like actually can sort of determine a type of form and kind of dictate some chord changes. It's also interesting to hold off, Cryss, like maybe in the way that you do it, and that gives you a chance to actually explore maybe pedal tones, or, you know, anything other than just roots, you know. And it's interesting to just do like some kind of like repeating ostinato on the bass, and then let the top end kind of move around and do different things, you know. So I guess I really don't have, you know, one way that I tend to go to. I guess it's just kind of wherever the flash of inspiration hits in that moment. But I always do love creating bass lines, and it's largely just because of growing up with my brother as a bass player, man. Like we played so many different kinds of styles, and that would have been in the 70s. So, you know, like there was a lot of great music out there, and so I got to lock in with him so often and really hear, you know, what a bass player does and how he defines the groove, and if he's playing ahead or just maybe just behind, or like where it's sitting, and all of that in relation to what I'm doing, that it's just I just like, it's ingrained in my brain. Bass lines are just so like important and just in my soul. I just hear them all the time. So that's one of my favorite instruments, obviously, just, you know, because it's like, well, let's say this about bass. It is the bridge between just percussion and anything melodic above it. It sits right in the middle as the bridge to like groove and rhythm, you know, and drums, basically. And then it's the bridge into also being melodic and, you know, and defining some, you know, root notes or whatever notes that it's playing. It sits right there. So it's got a very unique place, I think, like in a band strata. It's the thing that bridges drums to the rest of the band, really, in my opinion. I love bass.
Yeah, I've kind of felt similar, and, you know, in compared to like, I don't think electric guitar or a lot of the keyboards do this as well, but bass guitar and acoustic guitar tend to be like that, where that bass guitar is that connection with the kick and the snare, and the acoustic guitar is almost like the hi-hats that are going in a lot of, at least in a lot of tracks, like where the way they get kind of put in there, if it's not the main instrument, if it's something that's additional, but it serves that kind of thing where I tend to think of acoustic guitar exactly the way that you think of the bass in that regard, like where it is adding a melodic element that those those chords, but at the same time it's really about that kind of scratchy, that like real wispy strumming sound that it has, like especially when you do a lot of compression with it.
Absolutely, and I will comment in regards to that, just having had the good fortune of having done so many recordings in live band settings, song demos and personal personal projects and whatnot, custom projects with people, so where there's 6 or 7 people playing at one time, which is more of a Nashville thing. So like definitely, like I noticed early on, like way early on in my development of recording like that the acoustic guitar player would be like, can I get a little more hi-hat in the mix, and I'm like, because that's that's what he's keying off of for timing more than like the backbeat or the kick. And it does, I mean, sonically it fulfills that same thing. I mean, rhythmically it sort of does the same thing as what a hat does, but it lives in the same sort of frequency range, part of it does, right? Sonically it's kind of in that spot in the whole big picture. So that's that's pretty cool. Like it's interesting to think of it like that,
Yeah.
Like the drum set covers so much ground in terms of frequency that's covered, right? Like it covers a whole lot, but mostly it's that, high end for the hi-hat, mid range for the snare, and then, low end for the kick drum. So, I mean, it's kind of right there, just those 3 voices, those 3 things can do so much, but yeah.
This might be a natural place in the conversation to go to, like, how are you guys creating your bass tones? Because we're not, well, I should say, Shawn has done some great like solo bass work. I've seen some of the songs he's posted on Facebook. But when it comes to creating your tone, what are your secrets? And it's great because we have people in like widely different genres covered here, from electronic music, trance, techno, to rock, jazz, country, all this, all those and more. What are your secrets? Like, what do you go to? How do you make it fit in a mix or even live?
Okay. Well, I'll say for me, it really first starts with having a really good bass. And having a really good bass and knowing like what goes into a really good bass takes time, because there's aspects of the feel of what feels good and what sounds good. And for me personally, unless if I'm gonna record vintage sounding stuff, I almost exclusively use active basses. Okay, and that already starts your signal, with an active preamp, and it's a much hotter, almost compressed signal. And for me, I'm trying to achieve with clean tones what maybe Cryss, you are, or a lot of guitar players are doing with what's called gain staging, where you're like overstacking, distortions. And for me, even though I have a clean preamp in the active bass, then the secret is going through other preamps. And if I'm going to be recording, then I go through the Avalon U5 and a combination of boosting the bass signal even more from that with the active bass. And then into my Motu, into the mixer, I use like a vintage British style compressor. And sometimes like I like to put EQ and cut the highs and high mids, and like I really like the low mids and subs. And it's very, very important. For me, the secret to good bass tone is in the mid range. And depending on what you like, you know, if you want like a more hollow, open, deep bass sound, or no, more hollow, open, you need more upper mids. And if you want more like punchy, you need more lower mids. And if you want big and warm, you need more subs. And so, I'm really playing a lot with low mids and subs. There's actually like a 40 hertz custom switch on my bass that's very unique. So almost like some 808, like really like that extra oomph. Like if you have like, you know, a sub or, you know, the right cabinet speaker. But when I'm doing live, I'm trying to replicate it. And so I start going into a compressor, and I use the Empress compressor, and then I go into their EQ pedal, and then that has the compressor and the EQ on that. It's almost like Studio Rack here. That it has more gain and a boost in it, and then I'll go into my Aguilar preamp. So it's almost like I'm almost going preamps into preamps, and then what that allows me to do is play with a very light touch, you know, and then you can play with your dynamics, your touch, muting, and so like using a very hot signal, but playing with a very light touch, you know, that's probably, you know, how I achieve tones. And but again,
so
yeah,
I was curious, like when you're stacking your preamps, the Empress compressor is a great compressor. I used to use one on bass too. That's fantastic sounding. So with these different compressors, EQ, boost, preamp, how much of it is for equalization, compression, and even saturation throughout your chain? Like, what are they contributing to your bass tone?
Okay, so with the compressor, what it's doing is help the attack be more consistent, uniform, and even. And I don't try to do too intense of compression. I just try to do light impression and then like kind of use it as a boost. So it's evening dynamics and then boosting. And I think compression for me and in general, it's very important because, you know, with your technique, whether you're sequencing or, you know, playing with your fingers or using a pick, you know, you have to have kind of a percussive attack sometimes, and the compression really helps a lot with that. Now with the EQ, what it helps me do is basically attenuate certain particular frequencies in the low mids, and it just kind of like helps extend what I'm doing in my preamp. But my preamp, they're like fixed frequencies, so it just kind of extends, like with the EQ, I'm just kind of extending the Q or the bandwidth of like the type of tones I want on my active bass. I just like want to expand the you know, the bandwidth of the tonal range, like those low mids, like, you know, range of low mids, maybe just not one frequency. You know, depending on how thick or thin of your tone you need. And then the preamp is often so that, you know, I have an XLR signal if I need that to go into a mixer or house or record. Yeah. So that's why I put a preamp at the end to have like, I have a dual mono signal usually when I'm playing. Yeah. One's a 1/4 inch out, one's XLR. So I'll like do like dry, like it's like a dry wet mix type blending thing.
So is your philosophy the same for playing live as it is for recording, or is your
Yes.
recording base similar or different?
At this point, I'm trying to replicate the same things with pedals as I'm doing more with plugins and, you know, my preamp in the studio. So I want to be able to re-replicate both the same way, using different gear to do the same.
Mm.
But like I said, I have I usually use like a 5-string active bass. That's like what I mainly play. But in the studio, I really like to use 4-string passive basses and get almost like a Paul McCartney Motown, or like kind of just like a woody acousticy. Sometimes I like doing that, and I'm not trying to over EQ that.
Uh-huh.
So there are certain times, yeah, where, and honestly, like, Origin makes these, like, vintage bass style preamps and compressors, you know, that, like, I want to kind of get that, because I do vintage bass tones using flat wounds, using old school Dan Electro 4-strings, but, you know, like, getting into, like, vintage style preamps and like, compressors, EQs, like, that's kind of the next step, to kind of have a different style, because I like having a modern bass style, and then I like having like a vintagey style.
Yeah.
Too, just personally, because sometimes with synths and like, it's almost like the type of music I'm playing live. If I'm gonna write stuff, it's not the same. You know, I like using Mellotron strings or like ambient synth pads, and sometimes having like just a more simple, less intense bass. More, I like exploring that too.
And what would be like, just you got a lot of basses, but just like a choice out of each genre, like what is your go-to modern bass active, and what would be your like go-to vintage style bass?
Go-to modern is 5-string jazz bass active.
Mm-hmm.
Since 2013, baby. Like that's just it. Like 5-string like I feel like it's a cult, honestly. There's like a whole species of players that are just like 5-string jazz bass. And you know, I like, that's kind of been my thing. But then with the vintage thing, I like Dan Electro, because I can't really justify getting like a vintage P bass. And so I discovered that like Dan Electros kind of tap into that vibe, and they're really cool looking, and they're a lot cheaper, and you can just use pedals and other stuff to like sound like a $20,000, you know, 1960s P bass. And that's a secret I'll tell people, is just like buy like cheap like basses like Dan Electros and just use cool effects or preamps. And you know, if you really want that like 1950s 1960s Fender sound, like you don't have to like spend 10, 15, 20,000, which you kind of actually do if you really want to do. But that's just, it's a collector. You know, I like, yeah. Don't get me wrong. Like, I just recently actually bought like a 1950s Dan Electro that's like badass, you know. And, but like, you don't need to do that. Like, I was just curious what the difference is. And,
yeah.
But now,
seems to me that playability though of a classic, you know, Fender is one of the things that you want in your hands, you know. And I don't know that the Dan Electro basses have that sort of feel, you know.
No. For me, like I said, it's a bit like, for me, it's a very specific imitation of a 1960s vintage sound. I know it doesn't really, I mean, you could just get a modern P bass, and I have one.
Right.
That's my first bass, is a P bass. But
yeah.
For me too, they're short scale instruments, and like I forgot to mention that's probably the biggest reason I like the Danos, is that they just feel different with a 30-inch neck. A standard bass is 34, 5 strings 35. You know, so getting into like tiny instruments, I really like that stuff.
It does influence. Yeah, it does influence how you play it. So I've got like 3 regular scale basses. although the Ricky's just slightly shorter than the other two. But the Mustang bass that I have, same kind of purpose. I use it, and it's got the vintage style Mustang pickup too. So it doesn't, even though it's a Fender, it doesn't sound like a P bass. It has a sort of weird like 60s kind of thwappy tone, like a lot like the Dyna Electros do, but it does the scale's shorter and you feel different about it. The way that the tone sits, it's like the lows are tucked in a bit, and it's got a little more pronounced like mid range, and it just kind of steers me in different directions than I would on say like a P bass or a Stingray or something. I think that's kind of goes along with what you were saying.
I'll say this: short scale basses are really great for picks because you get more mid range and they're super punchy. Longer scale basses are more deep and acoustic, more hollow. So again, different types of instruments that have natural EQs, just different frequency emphases, make you play differently. And I think that's a cool thing, is just like going to a music store, plug into different amps, you'll play differently. And like, that's not like a gaff justification, but at the same time, it is cool that, sometimes I like to roll the tone off and play long notes, and get into this vibe. And sometimes I like to boost treble, some mids, and get some 90s grindy alternative shit. And so many different bass styles. Even maybe Marshall or Tim, you guys can talk about, different genres, right? Like where the filter's at, like the type of tone you're going for. Different EQs will make you play differently. What do you guys think about that? Like how different bass tones make you kind of write differently, if it's like brighter or like darker?
I mean, that's not just bass for me. That's everything. Timbre dictates what the part that's about to come from my interaction with that timbre. It's all about that. So yeah, for sure. I mean, drums are the same way. If the drums are tuned real dead, then I'm going to play it differently than if they're wide open and tuned up, kind of high. So, but absolutely true of any instrument, any timbre is what I'm responding to, basically. That's why it's fun when you go through like presets first off with a new synth, how you find yourself starting to write little things as you're interacting with that new sound. So it absolutely, from bass to drums to, high end, everything about the feel of it and the timbre of it is what I'm responding to. So it absolutely changes how I play, and the way I'm thinking of it. Like if it's a short tone, I'm going to think maybe of a faster part,
Yeah.
Like that kind of thing. It's just going to what naturally sort of happens, right?
Right.
Yeah, I'll pop in, but I'm really curious to hear what Marshall says next. But like I put up a post, so I doubled my bass collection last year from 2 to 4, or bass guitar collection anyway. And so I posted up a picture on Instagram, and I nicknamed them, and it was the Rickenbacker is Grizzly, the Stingray is Growly, the P bass is Thumpy, and the Mustang is Thwappy. And again, it kind of like, again, they feel different, but the sound and the response, the Ricky and the Mustang have looser string tension, so those are really fun basses to play. I really enjoy playing them because of the way they give so much, and I end up kind of digging into it a different way. But like with the P bass, it's probably one that I play the least, but also it's kind of, it does a one thing that I like, and I'm not really into modern rock P bass tones. I like more the 60s, like James Jamerson type of thing. So playing it, real vintage style, it kind of has that one thing, but I usually prefer to play one of the other basses. But yeah, it definitely kind of makes you play different types of bass lines when you're touching it. so going to synthesizers, like I don't know, like Marshall, how are you creating your bass tones? Is there some correlation with does the synth bass that you pick out cause different types of bass lines with you, or what's your process and how do you get your tone?
I actually like to layer a couple different sounds when I'm making bass lines, and I'll always use just a simple sine wave for the lowest frequencies, and then I build on top of that, because the sine wave is going to give you the cleanest low end, and that's extremely important in dance music. So I'll start with just low note sine wave, and then I'll layer sounds on top of that depending on what the track is going to need or what I think it's going to need. Or if I'm just playing around with sounds, like just starting to layer stuff and be like, ooh, that sounds cool. And I've got, arpeggiator running and some percussion going, and then I'll side chain the kick drum so it'll duck the bass line, so you don't get too much clashing in between your kick, because you also need to hear the punch from the kick. So it's pretty important to try and separate those as best you can. And I also find that tuning the kick to your fundamental note, whatever your fundamental note is that you're using for your whatever scale you're in or whatever, is a good idea, because it just makes it sound better, I guess. So that's kind of just the basics of it, right? And it's more of just experimenting, but I like to just to fill out that low section of the track. I'm layering like at least 3 sounds usually.
Marshall, I have a question about synth bass.
Yeah.
Now, because you can have various synths have different amount of oscillators, and each oscillator can be put into a different octave, I'm kind of curious if you think about like how many oscillators, on average a good synth bass line could have, and then like in each oscillator, do you tend to put the octaves in unison? Do you put them up octaves? I'm curious. Does that play any role in how you sculpt your bass lines?
It definitely can, and again, it's more just kind of like what I'm hearing. So if I'm playing around, if I'm doing some sound design stuff and I'm trying to make bass patches, then yeah, I may play around with adjusting octaves between the oscillators and things like that. I don't know that I think about it really on a technical level. It's more just kind of how does it sound. So as I'm playing around, I'll just dial something in and I'll go from there.
I will say that for me, for synth bass too, Marshall, like kind of along these same lines in this to Sean's question, but like sometimes I might come up with a really low indie bass sound that's really great by itself. In the track, it starts to disappear a little bit. Then I will typically add an octave above and just blend it in a little bit, so where that you can sense a little more of pitch, because obviously if you were talking really sub notes, it can be difficult to distinguish actually what the note is, right? You know what I'm talking about when it's really sub down there, like way.
Oh yeah, that's why I layer sounds usually.
Right. No, that's what made me think of that, because I mean I kind of do a similar thing. It just in terms of helping it to have some presence, I'll just add another octave above, or potentially even more, but not conspicuously. I'm not trying to make it sound like the bass part's in octaves, but just as an overtone series, basically. You know what I mean? And that helps it come out. And then and then the other thing I'll do is add a little bit of distortion. And I wanted to ask you about that, Marshall. How often do you put a little grind on it? Because I definitely do.
I don't tend to use distortion really on anything unless it's a sound that I want to sound distorted, like purposefully. So I don't really use distortion or saturation or anything like that on really anything. I forgot what else I was going to say. I was going to say something else there. But yeah. So not really I don't really use. I like it. I like to keep things as clean as I can. I think that's just a stylistic choice, though. You know,
Mm-hmm.
there's nothing wrong with doing that. I did one time though try and put a bunch of reverb on some bass, and that was really interesting because I know you're not usually going to do something like that, but just as an experiment, I made a track. This was years and years ago, but just to see what that would sound like, and it sounded pretty cool, but you obviously are going to lose a bunch of the punch from that bass line by doing that. But I thought it was kind of an interesting effect.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of what was that old song that was in the first Top Gun movie, whatever, Take My Breath Away. You know, it's got that really big signature, whatever. It's probably a DX. It's probably a DX, but it's got a bunch of verb on it. And it's just fulfilling a different role. Yeah, it's not doing anything rhythmical. It's actually kind of creating a pad and creating bass at the same time. So
yeah,
I think
to
that's
your point,
where
kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's like where fretless basses would do things like that a little bit more, where it's meant to be more of a ear-catching melodic part of it that just happens to be pitched low. But I would agree with like what you said, Tim. Like there's an interesting thing again, stylistically speaking, because obviously you wouldn't want to do this in all situations. But one of the things that really kind of woke me up because years and years ago, like home recording, and the thing that I always had problems with was bass, particularly the bass guitar. And I was like, man, it never fits right into the mix, and I couldn't figure it out. And I was having such a problem with it, and it was actually like listening to isolated bass tracks off of famous records that kind of got me to understand like, oh, and this would be a general mixing principle anyway, is that you don't need as much as you think as far as like frequency response. And so I think sometimes the thing is where you need tightness, and particularly more in rock records, like you don't need all the sub lows for that like you would for an electronic music song. I found like I began to tuck in the bass just a little bit, from the lowest frequencies, and then also like using just the right amount of saturation. And similar to what you were saying, Tim, about adding with synth bass, adding a little bit of the octave up, just barely perceptible to get the harmonics from it. I mean, that's something that saturation does also. And I'm not talking about fuzzing out your bass, although that's a cool thing and it's something that's totally different. But like adding just a light bit of grind, I think a lot of classic rock players already had that built in because the amps that they were using, these old tube amps, were turned up, and they just didn't have the headroom that a modern amp does. And so you got a little bit of that grind. And one of my favorite bass tones in a mix would be Geddy Lee on Tom Sawyer. It's just such a cool growly sound that, again, it's part of that is the saturation kind of making it punch and stand out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Were you going to say something?
Oh, yeah. Because, just on the topic of like whether to dirty up bass or to keep it clean, I often find that from stacking multiple preamps and using EQs that have boosts on it, you do get almost like a clean overdrive sound eventually, and what I like and what people have told me is like sometimes when I dig in or if I'm like snapping or popping really hard, sometimes that having a little grit, and that grit being like a dynamically responsive tone, but not something that is too overly prominent, is kind of cool. And but I would definitely say, that with recording, I try to not make my tone as deep and bassy as I do live. And definitely like that 40 hertz boost stuff I do live, I don't do that in the studio because it just sounds really, really muddy and
Yeah.
So actually that's kind of interesting, how there are sometimes some limits to, like, I guess, having to take back what I said earlier, you know, guys, about, like, it's cool to try to replicate for me what I do live in the studio and vice versa, but ultimately, yeah, I agree that, like, sculpting a place for bass, it not over dominating a mix unless you want that, you know, is nice. And you know, Marshall, when you were talking about experimenting with reverb, you know, I'll say outside of electric bass, you know, I grew up listening to psytrance myself a little bit, and Infected Mushroom was really the people for me, like, that's what I got really big into. And they used to have some bass lines where it sounded like some Mini Moog Model D stuff with, like, some heavy reverb, like spring reverb or room verb or something. And have you ever done that? Have you Tim or Marsha, have you ever, like, done that, like, heavy, I don't know, like, kind of like spring reverb on bass or something like that? It kind of does have that pad sound. Have you guys ever tried that?
I've done something kind of similar, but I've only done it one time, and it was a long time ago. It'd be interesting to try again, actually.
Yeah.
And the one thing I was going to say that I had forgot was one way to kind of verify whether or not you're able to hear the bass in your mix that I like to do is the cell phone test. So I will listen to my tracks back on the cell phone, just because the frequency response are not going to obviously get you the sub bass. But if you can hear your bass line in your mix on a cell phone speaker, you're probably okay.
Mm-hmm. That's a great, yeah. That's just a great observation for sure. Yeah.
It's shown that you do have to have some of those higher frequencies in there to be heard, because the phones have such a high cutoff on it.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
That's rolled off. Well, and in terms of what my experience is with using verb on bass, yes, I've definitely done it 3 different ways. One is like, I try to tailor the tail of it to be consistent with and not blurring too much of the part. Cell phones, what blasphemy is this? You know, so, like, in other words, I don't put too long of a tail on it. It's not going to be a 3-second tail unless the part is super legato and slow and taking its time. Then it's doing a cool thing. But then if it's kind of more of a normal type bass part that's going to obviously have some rhythm involved with it as well, then there's 2 things I like to do if you're going to put reverb on it. One is pre-delay, so that, you know, the actual bass tone cuts in first and then you hear the effect. So now it's not smearing it so much, you know, just like stick it out there. And then the other thing to do that's fun is to gate the verb on the back end. So then, again, you're just kind of creating, here's the sound, here's that little tail, and then it goes away, and it kind of just becomes part of the sound, you know? And so those are the things I've experimented with, you know, with varying results. I mean, you can come up with some unique tones, and if you build your entire composition around that, you know, leaving room for that sort of being the focus, then you can come up with some kind of interesting stuff.
Thanks for sharing that, Tim. I've never tried that, and I'm learning something new, and I feel like that would be really cool for synth bass or electric bass, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
It takes a little experimentation, and obviously it depends on the track and everything else, you know, sonically that you're either combating or trying to, you know, get with. So, but yeah.
I've got a question for you guys, actually. Do any of you guys tend to use sub drops, like bass sub drops in any of your stuff?
I have. It's not because I'm not very genre specific. It's not something that is constantly on my menu, but I absolutely have, and I love them. I mean, what's more effective than that? Like, it's so great, right?
Yeah, that's fun.
Okay, so I'll have to, like, maybe post some links after or something to some stuff where that I've done that, where there was some music I was doing in the 2010s where I was trying to like kind of do something in between prog rock and like EDM, and I actually felt like a lot of bass drops was really, really cool for transitions, and I would like cut out of playing bass, and I really, really would love using them for like building stuff, and then like, you know, going into some melodic stuff, because I wasn't trying to do some like, I'm not like the most developed dubstep guy or something like that, but I really, for like cinematic or like really deep energy, dynamic, up tempo stuff, I really think bass drops are cool.
Well, Marshall, let's ask the asker, like how. I mean, you use it fairly often, right? I mean, it's so cool, right?
I went. There was a time when I was early into the music production learning side of things that I was using sub drops like all the time. I do like Shawn, like I like to use them for transitions though sometimes. So
Yeah.
Cool.
you'll hear some of my stuff, and I usually do a percussive hit, and then I will layer in a sub drop, just so that if you're listening on a pretty good setup, you're gonna hopefully you'll feel it a little bit, you know.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I utilize one on one of my songs on my record, you know, my vocal record that I have that's out there called Heartfelt Absurdities, and yeah, I definitely use one big time. The song's called Our Great Escape, and it's just and it's exactly gets me from like this one moment to transition into a really, really big chorus, like the last chorus that's the biggest kind of thing. So yeah.
I want to say that like for me, like I used to go around when I was in Denver. I used to go around and watch a lot of local bands, and there was this band called Ion. They were a rock band. I don't know if they're still around, but I just remember they would incorporate these really thick sub bass drops in their tracks, and it would shake the whole building. And I thought it was really funny.
I mean, yeah, that's the sound when it's lights out, right? When you're just about to go into the coma.
It sounded amazing.
No, dude, yeah, that's an interesting thought, and that's strictly like an effecty or whatever, an effective, let's say, better than effecty use of bass, right? Like it's just a cool thing to and how many bass players do that? Boom to tap, that's their fill. Or like you're coming back in from like a broke down section, and the bass player and the drummer go boom, and it's
Yeah.
So it's like that's the bass drop right there, really, right?
Yeah, it's got a lot of power to that sound.
So effective, yeah.
As a side, like from what we were talking about earlier, I was just curious though. You're talking about reverb on bass. I'm curious though about have you any of you done that with kick drum at all?
I will do that on kick drums for again a transitional type sound usually, or if I want to emphasize a specific hit for some reason. Layering a kick drum with a massive amount of reverb is pretty cool sounding. It's almost like being in a gym and slamming the basketball down. You get the big reverb echo out of it too,
Yeah, that's right. It's great for a transitional moment or for a punctuation moment, or to signal that, the track, the vibe of the track, or the arrangement's about to go somewhere else. It's not really, I mean, you could, like make it part of the track, but you would have to write the part so that it really works with a real long tail, right? Like it would have to be non-standard. Yeah. This is not going to be, 130 beats per minute kind of thing.
Yeah, no, it's getting a little messy.
So what do you think about like Bonham never close mic'd, and particularly something like When the Levee Breaks, which is where they recorded the drums and the the entryway of that whatever large house or castle.
Yeah, that house. Yeah.
Of course, they used Benson Eckerek for the slap back on it to get that weird timing thing. But I mean, a big sound like that, would you ever use anything like that on an entire track where it was just like drenched in ambience?
I mean, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, there's so much attitude in that. And it's really all about the tail, you know. If the ambience just sits around the transient, like the transient's like here, and then you have this little ambience that's sitting around it on the outside about yay big and not just infinitely big, then it's just fattening that sound and making it. It's just, there's so much attitude to like a gated verb thing like that, or just like in a small room where the decay is just not very long, and depending on what the frequency response of the ambience is, then it's really, you know, it's really enhancing the basic sound. So absolutely, I've done many tracks like that. I mean, the studio I built in Berry Hill with my buddy, I mean, we had a big drum room, and you put a pair of, you know, nice ribbon mics, you know, 20 feet away, and yikes, you know, you squash that with some nice compression, and then just bust that in just a little bit. Oh baby.
So you're getting mainly lows from the close mic, and then mids and mids, upper mids, maybe some treble from the room mics then. So you're not hearing you're not hearing the thud, the real low end in the room mics. You're more hearing the slap, right?
Well, I mean, yeah, and also bearing in mind that the higher up you go and the further back you go to try to get more space, you know, if you're higher up, you're going to obviously hear more of the space, but you're also going to get more cymbals. So this isn't inherently a problem. So like a lot of times I'll put my room mics about this far off the floor and point them towards like the bass drum, you know, or the toms or whatever. So they're at least trying to directionally, you know, kind of reject some of the high end. Because again, yeah, if you add too much of that, then it's a big splashy washy mess, and you're ruining your drum sound. But if you can keep them low, and maybe, you know, low pass even the top end off of them if you need to. Hey, so that reminds me, something we did yesterday when I was tracking with Penn Jones Conspiracy and my friend Ben Jackson playing drums, and so we put a couple of gobos up right in front of the drums, a couple of you know, large baffles. And then on the not on the inside where the drums were, but on the outside of those, we put a couple of room mics down there. So it really muffled, it just filtered basically the top end out a lot. Man, that was interesting and cool.
Huh. So another question here, going back to bass, synth, bass guitar, probably more a bass synth question. Mr. Calfood asks, bigger question is stereo bass. Should one ever use it?
Dark question. $1 million question.
Should one ever use it?
So Steve
That's
says,
hilarious.
I mean, Juno bass is stereo bass, right? Juno chorus.
You know, if you think about One of These Days, Pink Floyd, that's stereo bass.
That's a very effective bass. He's using a Benson Eckerek on it, and a little bit of tremolo at the end.
Man, stereo bass, absolutely. Do not fear the stereo bass. I mean, the point of having things mono is that they don't get as diluted because they're right down the middle of a stereo mix. So they're going to cut, they're going to stay there, and they're not going to be wonky or, you know, have modulation and going out to the sides. But like, that might be exactly what you want to do. I mean, don't have that be everything be stereo, you know, but if you wanted to do stereo bass and then maybe have a mono kick with that, hey, like, that's still going to tighten it up and keep it centered, right? So
yeah, I would say that a lot of pedals today that a synth or bass could use are in stereo. And one other way you could think about using stereo bass that would be very practical is when there's a breakdown. So if you just like want to have a solo bass moment, having that in stereo would be beautiful and can, you know, be a melody, maybe an intro, outro, breakdown. And so, you could find some, not just within a groove or a rhythm context, but stereo. I think stereo bass, especially, even if you play high, if you want to play lead stuff, or that would be a good avenue to explore it in too.
I have to ask you this, Shawn, because a lot of times on sessions, I mean, just not a lot of times. Occasionally, there's a lot of joking that happens, as you can imagine, between if you're on a day and you're tracking 12 songs, during the day. And so, sometimes, I've done my take, I've gotten the drum take, and then I'll go back and I'll put on shaker or maybe some tambourine or something, right? While the other guys are maybe also overdubbing. But a lot of times, and this is to the stereo question, a lot of times I'll just get on the mic and go, yeah, okay, I'm going to double that after I've done my my drum track, But what was making, and I've heard bass players say the same thing, but what was making me think of that is, like, have you ever doubled your bass track and panned them out hard right and left,
Yes. Not me personally, but I have worked with producers that have done that because they had dual distressor compressor units, and so they were able to do that. I also think that when it comes to double tracking, if you're doing a slightly different performance, or if you want to take the same track and have it in unison and almost like a chorusing type effect, that could be a really cool way of using double tracking, since especially like in fretless and stuff, there's a lot of chorus, like that Jocko sound. So I think doubling your bass might give like an almost chorusing type of ambience.
Man, you guys were talking about Chili Peppers earlier, and that and what you're saying now makes me think of, there's this one track where they take the drums and they take the snare drum and they put more of the dry signal kind of to the left, and then a very more heavy affected and reverberated one on the right, and it's kind of like, ooh, that's sort of a no-no, but like I'd never even really actually noticed it before, so obviously it was working. I can't think of the song, but anyway.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of tracks, bass and drums that were like from the '60s, where, I mean, you listen to like Jimi Hendrix Experience and stuff like that, and sometimes in the Beatles, but you'll be like, the drum kit, it's mono, all right, but it's all the way on the left-hand side, or the bass will be on the other side, or some weird stuff like that.
Well, that's when they forced stereo mixes on them. I mean, they were meant to be mono, yeah.
Yeah, I've done a little bit of that. I did a remix of a track called First Embrace by it was like a synth pop group called Tristram, and I redid most of the instrumental. And one of the things I did is I kind of made I think of it in my brain, it's like a Y. So I still have my fundamental, sine wave bass up the center, and then some of the layered bass stuff I spread out stereo a little bit, and then I panned between them at certain sections of the song. So I have played around a little bit with doing some stereo bass, I guess, but I always keep that sign in the dead center.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
If you're listening on something where you don't have a right speaker for whatever reason, it's gonna, you're gonna lose all that low end there. So.
Right. Well, so that reminds me of like the nature of how really low frequencies and bass tends to not be very much something that exists in the stereo field anyway, because for instance, when you have a subwoofer, you've got a 2.1 system working, right? So you don't really, it doesn't matter if you set the subwoofer over to the left. It might be a little annoying, but it tends to not be so directional. As you go up in the frequency range, it becomes more directional. You can seek it out, right? So, but I know a lot of people use like stereo subs in their studios and live. So, what do we think of that? How are they using them? I don't even know. Are they panning? What are they doing? Why?
Why?
I mean, if it's not directional, why would you bother with stereo subs, you know?
I've seen that live, but not in studio. That's crazy. You've seen that in studios?
Yeah, I've heard of people doing it, yeah.
That's interesting. I wouldn't understand like, I could understand live for, like, just audience in a room, but what would be, I mean, yeah, maybe for mixing in a bigger room, could that, like, maybe if you're in a super big room, maybe I could see, I don't know.
Or is that, as far as I know, it's not an Atmos type application, because those are all just more like they're not low end content holders. So,
right.
I don't know. Yeah, it's odd to me. But there you go. I mean, that's just back to the stereo bass. Would we do it and why? Like, you don't really use stereo subs in your studio because, like, it's redundant. It's not really doing anything because you can't really sense the directionality of it, you know, with your ears.
Well, we are probably need to start winding it down here. And as I said at the beginning of the episode, like, this is just beginning to crack the topic, and there's so many things to talk about. Last week we really went down a rabbit hole with compression, and I think at some point in the future we'll have to revisit that topic, because that's certainly very relevant to our discussion on bass. But first of all, Shawn, thanks for being with us, man. You added so much to this conversation, and like I said, we barely got to crack it. Is there anywhere people can follow you or check out your music? Obviously, you have a Facebook account, but is there anywhere else?
Yeah. You can check me out on SoundCloud. And I'll actually put and then give me one moment. So, I don't know if this goes into YouTube or if you can help me, but if people go to SoundCloud, they can check out Rashava Band. That's kind of an alias of Productions, you know.
How's that spelled? We can find a link for it.
Did you see in the chat? Rishavah. Rashava. I just put it in our message thing. I don't know if you see it.
Got it. Okay, so I'm posting the link in the chat for people, and that'll take you right to it.
And he's gone.
Oh, well, perhaps
I'm going to get the link.
There we go.
Can I get the link?
Yeah, I think I found it and posted it in there.
Yeah, it's on there.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
We got you.
Thank you so much, Cryss, for inviting me on, and like Marshall and Tim. It's just a pleasure to rap with you guys, and I would definitely love to do this again, and feel like, you know, I would love to show you guys my studio, and maybe even we could listen to some music or do some demonstration or hear some tones, you know. I feel like this could definitely be continued, and would love to stay in touch with you guys and be involved with this. It's an amazing thing you guys doing, and I really appreciate like having the bass community, you know, get to be a part of this and grow with that. It's amazing.
Yeah, it was
right on. Yeah,
it was really great hearing about and being able to hear both synth and bass guitar perspectives in this conversation, and we really appreciated having you on. And what do you got going? I mean, you're like a crazy madman gigging, and so you're between gigs. If anybody has joined late, you're in the car because you're actually between gigs right now. That's how busy you are.
Yes. Look, I'm gonna roll down the windows. Can you hear? Like, people are jamming out right now. I'm like outside down a bar in downtown Jacksonville and living that life, you know. And I just look forward to eventually trying to, release music as a solo artist, and that's going to be a combination of using the bass and synthesizers. It's kind of been on the DL, but something that I look to share with this community as I grow with that, and that's something we'd love to, kind of continue
Awesome.
for future discussion. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll be looking forward to that. Marshall, what do you got going on?
I'm still working on my live stuff. I hit a couple of snags with some live patch switching that I'm trying to work out with the developer of the Blue Art. It's a problem because through parts of the songs, I'm muting some of the arpeggiators, and it's not actually sending my patch changes while they're muted, which I need it to do. So I'm waiting until we can get that fixed to really get going on that again, because that's a big problem. And then I started a second YouTube channel that I'm trying to develop some AI generated stories, and I posted my first one just the other day, actually. So it's a pretty fun project. So I think I'm gonna kind of keep working on that a little bit as well on the side.
Awesome! I didn't see that.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. So I'm generating images with AI art, text to art, and then I'm coming up with concepts, and then using like ChatGPT to help write the stories, and then using AI narration, and then putting it all together, and then doing original scores for the thing. So that's a little side project that I just started.
Wow.
Yeah, that's awesome.
That sounds.
I love that. You may have noticed, Marshall, that I'm a subscriber to that channel.
Oh, are you? I need to.
Did you notice? Yeah, I went and checked it out. I saw you posted about it, and I'm like, okay, what is he doing? What's he up to?
Well, thanks, Tim. I think you're probably like subscriber number 4 on there.
Yeah, I think I'm top 10. Yeah, for sure. No, it's really cool. I hadn't gotten a chance to comment on it yet, but I did sit and watch the whole thing, and I thought that's a really brilliant idea and really just fun and something to explore, right, with this new technology. So
yeah, and that's got
kudos,
the Osmos as the soundtrack on that.
Yeah, I saw that, man. Like,
yeah.
I mean, and clearly, like, it's definitely unique sounding. So that was very cool.
Yeah, thanks.
Very cool. Kudos. Oh, I'm just doing I'm doing my same bit too. I'm finishing up this film score, which I just got through the end credits. I'm basically done. I need to get approval, which will probably mean 2 more shots at revisions, but they're being kind of smaller revisions now and just little smaller things. So I'm about to be done with that. Pin Jones Conspiracy Record is like probably going to come out in August, and so I'm excited about that. And then I have another Synth Jam record I'm putting out, which is just a collection of like kind of some of the more aggressive ones I've done. But I just wanted to put them as a collection because I think that's helpful in terms of people finding them to stream them and whatever. And
yeah, well, that's great.
Yeah, so that. Cryss, how about yourself, man?
Yeah, I have been doing a little bit of everything. I worked on an old like 1952 or 53 Fender 5B3 Tweed Deluxe, which is a little tweed amp from the 50s, and it just absolutely rules. It was such a cool little amp, but fixed that, and so that was a fun little thing to do. And I've been doing some. I did some captures with a different Tweed Deluxe for some IK Multimedia Tonex software, and just did some today with my Soldano SLO. And I've not been writing music for a little bit, but I have been working on mixing, and so I've been taking a mixing class, and I've done a lot of like live mixing, but recording mixing, of course, just over the years I've done it, but I kind of felt it was like one of those things that I wanted to get a little bit deeper on. And even though there's a lot of great things out there, and I told everybody I'd been working on mastering more of Logic Pro, but as far as the more abstract concepts of of mixing in the box and that kind of stuff. I've been doing some of that, and so there's a YouTube channel. What's it called? Mixing with Mike, I think. Who does? You usually see him, like, people share his plugin review videos, but he was in-house engineer for, like, Whitney Houston and Bobby Brown, and it's done a lot of other people. But so I've been checking out some of his courses, and that's been good, and been learning a lot, and been having fun. So I guess that's
cool,
about
man.
it for me.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Awesome.
So I figured I put some money into something that would really help me a lot more than maybe another plugin would. So,
Dude, yeah, like education and learning, is that never gets to be old, or you're never beyond that. So,
yeah. Well, I guess that kind of brings us to a close. Again, thanks for everybody hanging out with us and talking in the chat. There's a lot of great comments and a lot of funny ones too this time. But
Yes.
we had a great time, and as I said, this is just the first of conversations about bass, and we'll be back here. Should be back here next week. I don't think we have a topic yet, but we look forward to hanging out, everybody, and really just trying to get better at doing all this stuff. And again, if you want to join in the conversation or post something in the Thru Port Collective Facebook group, we invite you to come on in and check it out. A lot of really cool people there. So other than that, I guess we shall say goodnight and have everyone have a good evening. And Shawn, have a good second gig or fourth or whatever it is today.
Yeah, no. I'm here. They're probably on their last tune. We'll see. But thank you again so much.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks,
Everyone
Shawn.
take care.
All right. See y'all.
Take